The tragic life of Princess Alice of Battenberg, the mother to Prince Philip. Princess Alice of Battenberg is a pivotal member of the royal family, from her connections to Queen Victoria as her great-granddaughter, as well as having Queen Elizabeth II as her daughter-in-law. However, the life of the mother of Prince Philip was far from a fairy tale. It was played with tragedy, but also heroism. She undertook a heroic mission during World War II, but ultimately was left abandoned in a mental asylum and forgotten by her family. Famously, she came into this world with a special witness that was her great-grandmother, Queen Victoria. In the tapestry room of Windsor Castle she arrived, and this was a faraway dream from the unfortunate end to her life. Her connection to the Queen ensured she would be embroiled in the messy game of European royalty. The royal life sounds like a fairy tale, but it took its toll on Alice as she was carted around Europe throughout her childhood. She rarely stayed in the same place for long, and she spent a lot of time darting between Darmstadt, London, Guggenheim and Malta, with countless diplomatic trips sprinkled throughout. It didn't take long for her parents to notice that there was something different about Alice. She had not started to talk, even though she had reached the typical age of a child who would begin to talk. The weeks and months passed, and yet Alice hadn't yet said a word, so they were happy when she finally began to mutter her first words. What puzzled them the most was that her pronunciation was off, leaving her doctors and parents concerned. Alice's parents sought an answer to their daughter's speech problem, and they received an answer that they were not expecting, nor did they want. It was Alice's paternal grandmother, Princess Julia of Battenberg, who provided her parents with an explanation that Alice was potentially deaf. This was wary news for the royals, but Alice's mother took a personal interest in her early education, and much to her surprise, Alice was extremely intelligent. She would go on to be able to speak and lip read in both English and German. Princess Alice never let her deafness stop her from progressing throughout her life, but due to the times that her family would always perceive that she had something wrong with her, no matter how many achievements she made. The British royal family was having a dire time. Prince Albert Victor had just died suddenly, and his fiancée had gone on to get engaged to his surviving brother. Mary of Teck was the name of George, his brother's new fiancée, of whom Alice was a bridesmaid for at the uncomfortable wedding. 8 years later, at the age of 16, Alice would attend the funeral of Queen Victoria before going on to attend her great-uncle's coronation shortly afterwards. Although a boring occasion for her, it became a pivotal one, as she would meet someone who would change her life forever. The coronation of King Edward VII brought together the cousins, aunts and uncles of Europe, who were all intertwined by marriage and relation to the British monarchy. Every prince and princess had been matched-made by Queen Victoria, who loved to meddle in the love lives of her children and grandchildren. One of the royals who would attend the coronation would be Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark. If it wasn't love at first sight, it was very close. Alice and Andrew moved quickly, and their relationship blossomed from the very first meeting. They were married in 1902 after just a year of courting. They were lucky to conceive 4 daughters before finally conceiving a son. This young boy, the baby of the family, would go on to marry Queen Elizabeth II and become Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh and consort of the British throne. However, Alice would not take to motherhood for long before taking up a new life as a nun. She had taken inspiration from her travels to Russia with her cousin, the Grand Duchess Elizabeth Fedorowna. Her cousin was part of the Bolshevik family, and they would go on to be tragically killed by the Romanovs. Her cousin had inspired her to live a more religious lifestyle, and sure enough, this became her new passion in life. She gave away most of her possessions and started preparing for an ascetic, spiritual experience. Although what came next was not the fairy tale that she had envisioned. Things were spiraling down before the World War, but now the Greek liberation movement had gained traction, and that was not good news for a royal like Alice. Then came the war, and her family situation worsened further when her brother-in-law, who was King Constantine I, refused to take a side in the war. It would not be long before Alice was stranded with her family, huddling in the cellars of a palace while the French bombed Athens. This terrifying scene was only the start of tragedy in her life. As they sat there, the building shaking around them, Alice must have simply prayed for her nightmare to be over. Join me in part 2 to discover how the situation in Greece worsened, leaving her to flee and fight for her and her family's life. I will then delve into the beginnings of the downturn of Alice's mental health and how she ended up in a mental asylum. By June of 1917, the Greeks had ultimately just about had enough of their king and all of his relatives, and that included Alice herself. The democratic government demanded that King Constantine I abdicated. They then exiled the entire royal family to Switzerland. This was perhaps finally a bit of respite and safety from the conflict, but this feeling of security would not last very long, as she continued to be put in danger. Supporters of the exiled king restored Constantine to the throne, and this then allowed her and her family to return home. The Greeks lost the Greco-Turkish War, and in the aftermath, a military coup snatched power and exiled the royals yet again. They probably didn't know if they were coming or going at this stage. It was a disaster for the monarchy, and Alice was in even more danger than most. The coup meant that Prince Andrew became a target. Any military officials with relation to the monarchy were arrested. The king's brother couldn't have been any closer to the king, and it therefore comes as no surprise that he was captured. Andrew sat in captivity, as many of the other officers who had also been arrested with him were tried, and one by one they were then executed. Alice had to wait while she worried profusely to hear her husband's fate, and her own along with it. Maybe all her praying paid off, as she was saved at the last minute when she managed to escape Greece. Her relations to the British royal family served her well with her connections in England. This was one of the perks of being the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and it was due to this that when it was evident that Prince Andrew's family were in danger, they sent a British cruiser, the HMS Calypso, to take them out of Greece. They ended up putting roots down in Paris, and they were able to enjoy a quiet life alongside other Greek refugees for a while. It felt like Alice could finally have some peace, but in pure Alice fashion, this would not last long. Though World War I had put Alice's religious interests on hold, now that she had free time and enough time to think, she began to go back straight to work. She converted to the Greek Orthodox Church and started plans for a religious order of nurses, the same plan that her martyred cousin, Elizabeth Federona, had outlined all those years ago to her. People were starting to become suspicious of Alice, and they noticed that she was different once again. It was related to her hearing once again, but not for the same reasons. It was during this time in her life that Princess Alice started to profess that she was communicating with spirits who were sending her divine messages. She told people that she was in direct contact with Jesus Christ, But surprisingly, she was also in touch with the Buddha. The people who were closest to her started to gradually become worried by her frightening behaviour, and it was going to get worse before it got better. As well as being able to talk to spirits and godly powers, she then became convinced that she would heal people with new powers given to her by God. Her family became scared. She had suddenly taken a turn for the worse mentally, and so they sent her to multiple specialists to attempt to find out what was happening. The answer they got, they did not want, and Alice's future was sealed in tragedy because they said that she was a schizophrenic. Alice's family arranged for her to see the greatest psychiatrists in Europe with no expense spared, and one by one they all reached the same diagnosis, that Princess Alice was a paranoid schizophrenic. You would think by today's standards that she would get a lot of help to make her better, but this couldn't have been more wrong. Tackling mental health during this time was an art form that no one had quite managed to tackle, and there were some devastating methods among the solutions to mental health. Perhaps due to embarrassment, her royal family connections could not get her out of this one, and her days of royal privilege were officially over. Following her diagnosis, the royal family could only think of one thing to do with Princess Alice, and it wasn't beneficial for anybody. Princess Alice was forcibly taken away from her children and tossed in Ludwig Binswanger's infirmary in Switzerland. This was no bedlam. This was the place that royals and high-flying people in society were placed. The richest of people went here for help, but to Alice it was nothing more than a prison. Princess Alice was royalty, and she was living in a very posh sanatorium, which attracted the greatest minds of the day who wanted to study and understand her condition further. One of the greatest of all time, Sigmund Freud, was introduced to Alice by her doctors. He was the poster boy of psychoanalysis, and he came up with some bizarre ways to help Alice, and as his theories often were, he applied his bizarre beliefs to her diagnosis. Sigmund Freud believed that Princess Alice's hallucinations were caused by sexual frustration, and this is what he believed was behind all of her mental illness, so it is no surprise that he thought the same for Alice. He didn't just stop at diagnosing the cause of her illness though, he had a treatment in mind too, and his solution was completely deranged. Sigmund Freud persuaded her doctors to x-ray her ovaries in an attempt to dampen her libido and, in course, fix her mental health issues. Of course, this did not work as expected, and while these solutions failed, she was trapped there for days and days, and she was being kept against her will, and she wanted to escape. The whole time that Princess Alice remained locked up in the sanatorium, she demanded that she was sane and begged all who would listen to be let free. And she didn't just ask to leave. She physically tried to leave on multiple occasions, but the guards would forcibly bring her back to live in misery. All she had left was to listen to the doctors and hope they might one day let her walk free again. And that day did eventually come, but the damage had already been done. While she was kept prisoner, her family all but forgot about her and went about their lives in ignorant bliss. Her relationships began to break down, and she grew more and more distant from her husband. Her daughters all married German princes, while her son, Prince Phillip, went to Britain to stay with Alice's brothers. Alice did get out, but her life had already gotten away with itself. Join me in part 3 to learn how she abandoned her family right back, and the heroism she showed in the years after her imprisonment at the asylum. Princess Alice stayed a prisoner in the sanatorium for 2 painful years. She pled for her freedom frequently, but her requests were always ignored. When she was ultimately allowed to leave, she was completely over her disappointing family, who had almost abandoned her, and so she wished to be left alone at last. The only person that she was still in contact with was her mother via letters. She had no contact with anybody else, and she refused to talk to them. They had betrayed her once, and they wouldn't gain her trust again that easily. Alice settled into a simple and obscure life in Central Europe after her time locked away. She stayed here for the years to come, but in pure Alice fashion, her entire life would be thrown upside down once again. Princess Alice would have loved to have been left alone, but World War II made that very hard for her, if not impossible. The distance from her husband was the worst it has ever been. She had hardly seen him for a decade of her life, but she still desired to be with her people. During the time of fighting, she settled in Athens. This was while the rest of the Greek royal family fled the country for South Africa. It would have been easy to hide in palace walls, but that was not Alice's fate. She was ready to work, and she wanted to help. Alice had been living in a small and humble flat, which was a far cry from her extravagant beginnings in life. She moved to the former royal palace in the middle of the city. It was here that she began providing help to the people impacted by the conflict in the city. This became the base of operations with the Red Cross. The help she offered included soup kitchens, as well as smuggling in medical supplies into the country from Sweden. She was able to get away with this by using her sister Louise, who she would say that she was visiting. Princess Alice worked tirelessly to help the people of Athens, which became ever more a difficult task as the war raged on and she was devastated by what she saw. Mussolini fell in 1943, and as a result the Axis forces occupied Athens. This was a dark moment in history for all involved, including Alice. The Germans deported 60,000 Greek Jews to concentration camps, and only 2,000 of these people survived, while the rest were brutally murdered. There was only so much that Alice could do against these brutal forces. She wanted to help protect her people, and she really did try her best. Alice's two daughters were married to Germans, and so they presumed that she was one of them. This is how she was able to get away with staying behind in Athens. She was even treated with respect as a result, but little did they know that she had an ulterior motive. A German general personally paid her a visit and asked her if there was anything that he could do for her, and he must have been very surprised by her feisty and defiant response. Despite her German son-in-laws, Princess Alice was stubbornly opposed to the Germans, so when the general asked what he could do for her, she looked him in the eye and she barked back, "You could take your troops out of my country." That is just the kind of woman that Princess Alice was. Her demand was a courageous, if not a stupid one, but there was more that she was hiding that could ultimately have led to her death if it ever got out. Years later, in 1913, a Jewish man named Cohen aided the king of Greece. He was promised a favour in return for his help. This was the worst time for a Jewish man to try to claim back his favour, but he sought the help of the monarchy, who had promised him payback. When he arrived at the palace, the king was long gone, but Alice remained. As a remaining royal member left in the palace, he would appeal to her for help. Alice could have ignored his request, but she wanted to help where she could, and so she did not turn him away. Princess Alice took in the Cohen family and hid them from the Germans for the rest of World War II. Jews were being deported in mass numbers, and there was very little that Alice could do to help, but she could do this for this one family. This was a courageous act, which if found out she would have been executed. Later, Israel's Holocaust Memorial Institution would declare her righteous among nations for her efforts. She remained in Athens with the Cohens until 1944, when the Allies liberated the city. But Alice's bad luck was not over yet, and there was much more to come. The fighting continued in Athens, and although it had been liberated, the conflict still existed. Axis had finally fled, but the communist guerrillas remained, and they wanted to take control of the capital from the British. If the conflict before wasn't devastating enough, this conflict was even more dangerous, and the streets became a battleground. Alice had been a war hero, and she was not ready to give up her help yet. She was a brave woman who still had a desire to help all that she could. The streets were a dangerous place, and the British begged Princess Alice to stay in obscurity, out of the danger, but she didn't listen. She walked the streets brazenly, giving out rations to children. One man tried to warn her that a stray bullet could strike her at any minute, and her reply was characteristically witty. "They tell me that you don't hear the shot that kills you, and in any case I'm deaf, so why would I worry about that?" Alice left Athens in 1947 after an eventful few years, the complete opposite to what she wished for as a life as a nun. Her son, Phillip, was getting married, and Alice was intrigued to who he was marrying. We know now that his bride was the future Queen Elizabeth II. Alice had become used to her environment in war-torn Athens, and so her trip to England must have been a strange and peaceful experience for her, after she'd been living in squalor for years. She did not have much left. Her possessions had been lost along the way, been abandoned, or she had given them to others in need. She had a few jewels left from her more privileged days, and some of these were made into jewellery for Queen Elizabeth, Prince Philip's new wife. Alice didn't have much to offer her new daughter-in-law, but she had some of her jewels used to make Queen Elizabeth's engagement ring. Alice's life was turbulent, filled with the highest of highs and the lowest of lows. She had just arrived in England after living in her war-torn country for years. And while in England, she was attending her son's royal wedding, while sitting opposite the King of England himself. It must have seemed like a distant memory that she was abandoned in an asylum and begging for her freedom. World War II was finally behind her at last, and it was time for her to start a normal, stable life. So what was she going to do? Join me in part 4 to learn how she slowly went senile, and how she finally got in touch with some of the family that abandoned her before she tragically lost them once again. Her life was to be taken another unexpected downfall once again. Princess Alice not once neglected the memories of meeting with her aunt, Elizabeth Federona, who spoke of starting a nursing order of nuns. This dream was only a thought away for Alice, and was perhaps a motivator in getting through her troubles. Tragically, Elizabeth lost her life in the Bolshevik Revolution, but Alice kept her spirit alive by making her dream come true eventually. And she started the Christian Sisterhood of Martha and Mary. Her mother couldn't believe it of her own daughter, exclaiming, "What can you say of a nun who smokes and plays canister?" After her own family had sent her to a sanatorium, Princess Alice rarely saw anyone from her family for the rest of her life, and for the years that followed her freedom, she had absolutely no contact with them at all. It was perhaps her intention to never see any of them again, but tragedy forced her to change her stubborn plans when she lost her daughter. Princess Alice received devastating news in 1937 that a freak accident had occurred involving her daughter Cecil, her son-in-law, and 2 of her grandchildren. They lost their lives in an air accident that shocked and saddened the world and the royal family. Although she had not been seen by Cecil in many years, the loss still hit her very hard. Alice would see the rest of her family when she attended her daughter and her family's funeral. And she had been estranged from her husband for at least 6 years, when she was awkwardly faced with his presence alongside her son at her daughter's funeral. Philip had been only a boy when she'd seen him last, and now he was a strapping 16-year-old boy. They all shared an understanding, tearful reunion, and it took this tragedy to regain contact with her son, but her relationship with her husband was too far destroyed to reconcile. Alice never forgave her husband for sending her to an asylum and abandoning her there. But her husband had been banned from Greece, and this didn't stop her from returning shortly after to work with the poor. Then World War II broke out, and 5 more years passed with the couple not seeing one another. And when Athens was liberated, she sought to see her husband again, but it was too late. Prince Andrew succumbed to heart failure in Monaco. He had barely seen Alice a handful of times since he sent her to a sanatorium in 1930, and the last time they'd met had been in 1939, 5 years before his passing. Alice told of her horrors during the war to her son, and she emphasised the desperate final days the German occupation had been, and how she had gone many months without meat of any kind. When the British arrived, she had been living on nothing but bread and butter for weeks. The liberation came just in time, because only a little while longer Alice might not have made it. Alice was not a person who desired physical items anymore. She was a humble lady, and this meant that she stuck out like a sore thumb at her son's new wife's coronation. The newly appointed Queen Elizabeth II had one of the most extravagant gilded events in the world, and Alice wore a simple grey dress and wimple, like a nun's habit. She did not stick around for long, and shortly after the coronation, she returned to Greece once again. Greece had always been her home, despite none of her family living there for years, and her own monarchy being in disarray. But as always in Alice's life, that wasn't to stay a stable home for long, as she had to flee once again. Alice would have loved to have stayed in Greece, but the Colonel's coup of 1967 made life there far too dangerous to stay, even for Alice. She had already been a hero during the war, and this title alongside her royal blood made the military dictatorship doubly a threat. Queen Elizabeth and Prince Phillip heard of her struggles, and they generously invited her to live with them at Buckingham Palace. However, while she made it out of Greece, she didn't have much time left. The people of England were beginning to spread rumours that Prince Philip's mother was going mad. Her appearance at the coronation had only fueled these rumours, due to her humble nun clothing. Alice was a frailer, deafer, and older version of herself, but she still remained fully lucid until her final days, before passing away on the 5th of December, 1969, in Buckingham Palace. Upon her passing, it would become evident just how penniless the royal was. She had no possessions left at all, and absolutely nothing to pass on. She had generously given all that she had to charities throughout her life, as well as her time. Prince Alice's final wish was to be interred in Jerusalem at the Church of Mary Magdalene on the Mount of Olives. In 1988 she got her wish, and her remains were moved from Windsor Castle to the Holy Land. Later, Prince Philip visited the city, and he said, "I suspect that it never occurred to her that her action was in any way special. She was a person with a deep religious faith, and she would have considered it to be a perfectly natural human reaction to fellow beings in distress."